As the fall came and went, there were still no reports of slave catchers. Soon the fourth winter that the Crosswhites spent in Marshall was upon them. Christmas was celebrated with great joy. Then it was early January. Baby Francis was 10 months old and getting into everything. One day Ben came running in the front door, stomping the snow off his feet. "Sadie, look! Someone left you a package on the porch. It has your name on it." He handed Sadie a small calico bundle tied with twine. There was a note. Sadie untied the package. Everyone gasped. It was January Sparrow. The note just had 3 words: "I found you." Sadie's mamma dropped to her knees on the kitchen floor. "The patty rollers and Mr. Troutman has found us. They know where we are," she cried. "No, mamma. January left it. I just know it. I can feel it in my heart." Sadie gasped as she held the sparrow close to her cheek. "Oh, baby," Sarah whispered as she knelt in front of Sadie, "your daddy put January in his grave himself. You know that. You have to know that," she said as she hugged Sadie. Then she turned to Ben and Cyrus. "Go fetch your father," she hissed. Sadie froze inside. Maybe her mamma was right. Her father did warn her not to tell anyone about where they'd come from, and she told Polly. Maybe Polly told someone without meaning any harm, or maybe this was all Sadie's fault. When Cyrus and Ben came back with John and their father, Mr. Gorham and Mr. Ingersoll was with them. Sarah told them what happened and showed them January Sparrow. Gorham spoke first. "The only stranger here in town lately was a lawyer looking to open his practice here. He told me he was an abolitionist. Of course I told him nothing about anyone." Mr. Ingersoll sat in a heap at the kitchen table, rubbing his chin. "Do you remember what his name was?" Adam asked Gorham, fearing what he might hear. "Yes, his name was Francis Troutman," Gorham answered. "Troutman? My lord! I should have told you the names of the people that would be looking for us. I guess I never did." Adam's voice trailed off. Sadie and her brothers grabbed onto each other and rocked with fear. Adam paced back and forth. "What we gonna do?" Sarah wailed. "There's not a Negro or white man, for that matter, in this here town that is gonna give you up to them," Ingersoll said sternly. Wait a minute," Gorham broke in. "He left town this afternoon. He wouldn't have left if he thought he had found you." Sarah reared up and snatched the sparrow out of Sadie's hands. "But Sadie Sparrow, Sadie Sparrow," she wailed as she shook it in each of their faces. "Someone knows exactly who we are and where we are." Next 2 weeks, folks in Marshall was watchful, but no one came into town that wasn't known to them. Folks started feeling easier. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, January 27th, 1847, when Adam Crosswhite was jarred awake by a fierce pounding at his front door. Thinking it might be Mr. Gorham, he opened the door. 3 men pushed past the door so hard that it almost wrenched clean off its hinges. It was Francis Troutman, Willie Ford, and Jimmy Lee. Lee seized Adam and tried to force him out the front door into a waiting wagon. David Giltner, the master's son, was driving. But Adam broke free and raced upstairs, shouting for his family to hide. The 3 was right behind him, but he barricaded his bedroom door, threw open his window, and fired a single shot into the air. "They are here!" Adam yelled. "They are here to take us away!" He hoped Auction Bell heard. Adam could see lights in the windows up his street just as the 3 men broke down his door and seized him. As they dragged him down the stairs, Adam could hear Auction Bell ring down the streets, already hollering for help. Sadie and her brothers had hidden in the attic eaves, but one by one Lee and Ford reached in and grabbed him out. Sadie started praying. "Dear God, turn me into a sparrow and let me fly far, far away from here. Dear God, turn me into a sparrow and let me fly far, far away from here," she chanted. Then she felt a hand grab her by the hair and drag her down the stairs, her back bumping each step and bruising all the way down. Lee and Ford flung all of the Crosswhites in a heap on the kitchen floor, then tried to force them all to their feet and out the door into the waiting wagon. "It's freezing out there. My children need their coats and boots," Sarah pleaded. She pulled her children around her. Then her eyes fell on David Giltner. He was just standing there in the kitchen. "David, you," she whispered. He hardened his gaze and didn't look away. "I am here representing the interests of my father, and we are with our rights to take you all back to Kentucky," he barked. Sarah came close to his face. "My milk made your bones, boy," she whispered through clenched teeth. "I held you at my breast and raised you up as my very own, and now you can do this to me?" Tears filled her eyes. "Do you think your daddy finally gonna love you for doing this?" she hissed. David Giltner looked away and went out to the wagon. auction bell kept ringing. A crowd started gathering outside of the Cross-White house. People, both white and colored, started screaming down the street with sticks and hammers, torches and clubs. They were all riled up and shouting and shaking their fists. Some of the men even dropped their coats in that bitter cold and were fixing to fight. "You ain't taking these Cross-Whites anywhere," they yelled. They surged forward, shook their fists, and pounded on the outside of the Cross-White house. They was comin' from every direction. Even Lee and Ford looked scared. That's when Francis Troutman went outside, drew his revolver, and pointed it at the crowd. Stand back, I say," he ordered as he spun around, pointing the gun at them. The crowd pulled back. The deputy sheriff pushed his way from the back of the crowd and stood with Troutman, glorying at the crowd. "These here men," he announced over the din of the mob, "have the right under the law to reclaim their property." The crowd roared. "Property? People ain't nobody's property," a voice called out. The deputy tried to shout over the protest. "These here Negroes are the Giltner's property. It's the law. Now all of you stand down," he barked. Troutman holstered his pistol and crossed his arm defiantly outside the front door. In the house, Jimmy Lee lurched at Sarah Crosswhite and latched baby Frances by her ankles. "We're taking 'em, and none of you can stop us. That's the law," Lee growled. Sarah screamed and fell back, still holding her baby. Lee pulled at both of them as Sarah skidded on the floorboards with her heels. Suddenly the crowd parted and Gorham and Ingersoll came bursting through inside the house. They wrestled the baby away from Lee. "This child was born in a free state. She is a free-born citizen of Marshall, and you cannot take her," Gorham shouted. He and Ingersoll forced the Kentucky Four out of the Crosswhites' kitchen and shoved them out the front door. Then Gorham and Ingersoll stood with their backs on the door, the Crosswhites safe inside. Gorham leaned into Francis Troutman's face. "Like I said, ye ain't taking these people anywhere." The crowd surrounded the four and leaned toward them, crowding them in. Francis Troutman straightened his coat and tried to catch his composure. "I want all of your names." He took a pad from his pocket. "And I ain't taking these names to your magistrate, demanding that he order your arrest. You are all breaking the law," he thundered over the grumbling crowd. The crowd suddenly grew quiet for a long moment. Then a Negro stepped forward. "I is Planter Morris," he said. "I'm James Smith," another said. "I'm C.W. Hackett," still another said. "And I'm Charles Berger." "I'm Willie Parker." One after another stepped up and wagged their heads, mocking Troutman. Then Ingersoll, Hurd, Easterly, and even Dr. Comstock, all white men, gave their names. "And I am Charles Gorham, spelled Gorham. Be sure you put it in capital letters," Gorham said triumphantly. The crowd roared its approval and started to push at each of the Kentucky men. They jostled them about like bouncing balls, laughing when one lost his balance and fell. Even the deputy was full of fear. He drew his gun and fired into the air. The crowd pulled back. He turned full circle, aiming his pistol at everyone. "The fact remains," he said breathlessly, "that these here Crosswhites are fugitive slaves." He whirled around as the crowd roared. "Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, these men have the legal right to take back these here slaves," he turned around, "to their rightful owner." The crowd roared at him. He lifted his pistol at them again. "Their rightful owner, Mr. Francis Giltner," the deputy shouted. The crowd seemed to pull back. "What if he's right?" a voice called out. Then the crowd just stood there. No one seemed to know what to do next. Then a lone voice called from among them. "If you let these men take this family back to Kentucky, they'd be whipped and tortured and left for dead, like I was." A young Negro stepped forward and stood in front of the Crosswhites' door, facing the crowd. "This is what will happen to them," he said as he removed his overcoat and then his shirt. In the bitter cold, steam rose up off of his scarred skin. He put out his arms and slowly turned his back to the crowd. All that stood there was stunned to silence. "You," Ford hissed as he stared at the young man. "Boy, you should be dead." "We should have lynched you," Lee grumbled as he spat at the young man's feet. January, I knew you was alive," Sadie called out as soon as she saw his face. She took his hand and pulled him into the kitchen where all the Crosswhites wept and hugged him. "You've come for us. Praise God, you come home to us," Adam cried as he held January's face in his hands. Outside the front door the crowd was louder and angrier than ever. January gave them the reason to press into the Kentucky Ford like a Michigan tornado. They pushed at them, tugged at them, and yelled at them. When Mr. Gorham put his hand The crowd listened. "This is a matter for Judge Horbert," he said. "Judge Horbert, Judge Horbert," the crowd roared as they pressed the Kentucky Four right up off their feet. Then they herded them down the street like cattle, right down to the courthouse. All of the Crosswhites shed tears of happiness, even knowing their life here in Marshall was over now that Gilter knew where they was. I wasn't safe either, now that they knew January, was alive. We all would have set out for Canada. Within the hour we had almost finished packing what we could when Mr. Ingersoll arrived in his wagon to take us to Jackson to catch the train heading for Detroit. He came all out of breath and covered with snow, but he was smiling so broadly everyone wondered why. "Judge Horbert just jailed Lee, Ford, and Giltner and Troutman for attempting to kidnap you, and for assault," he said, laughing and slapping his knee. Adam and Sarah looked at each other puzzled. "His clerk said to tell you all that he is going to hold him there in the jail for the next 2 days. That should give you enough time to get to Canada before they catch up to you," Ingersoll trumpeted. Sadie smiled to herself. She knew exactly why Judge Horbert kept them there. Polly must have told her father the secret. "Thank you, Polly," Sadie whispered to herself and then smiled, but tears filled her eyes. There would be no time to say goodbye to Polly, her best friend. "I guess some secrets is meant to be kept, and some ain't. Now I said at the beginning that this here story is Sadie's story, but I guess it's as much mine too. That day back in Kentucky when I was beat so bad and left staked out for dead that night, Adam came for me. He carried me himself into the woods and hid me with Thaddeus Quill. Oh, he dug my grave all right, but he put nothing but field rocks in it. He marked it so the master and the paddy rollers would never look for me again. When the Crosswhites left, Thaddeus brung me Sadie Sparrow. He knew how much she loved it, and he knew that one day I'd find her and give it back to her. So I carried that sparrow for 4 years, all the while hoping to find the only family I ever knowed. I guess I repaid Adam Crosswhite for saving my sorry life by being there early that morning when the paddy rollers was trying to take him and his family back to Kentucky. Now we's a family again. We left Marshall knowing there was talk of freeing the slaves and even talk of war with the South, so's even though we was all so sad to leave, we was full of hope too. After we was gone, Francis Troutman did come back to Marshall and took all them men that gave up their names to court. Because of the Slave Act, they was forced to pay. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and in the middle of the war between the North and the South, the Civil War, he gave all slaves their freedom. Now I knows all the history books will say that the war was started with the first shot fired at Fort Sumter, but for us and all the citizens of Marshall, Michigan, the first real shot was fired that morning in January 1847 by Adam Crosswhite. Leastwise, that's what we believe. After the Civil War, the Crosswhites returned to Marshall. They lived out their lives both there and in nearby Battle Creek in freedom and peace. Sadie remained a lifelong friend of Polly Hobart Chancellor and continued to be a devoted sister to her beloved January Drum. Upon January's death and shortly before her own, Sadie Crosswhite Crosby held her most prized possession bundled in a faded piece of worn calico. Inside was a small carved sparrow. She took it to her fireplace and committed it to the flames. Then she spoke these last words to her only son: "It's fixin' to fly, and so is I."